Good morning, and thank you for joining us today for the third event in our series, Wait, You Collect What? Where we dive into the specialty collections that give some of our organizations unique challenges. My name is Beth Sanders, and I'm the Vice Chair of the Registrars Committee Western Region, and I'm here to guide us on today's dive into collecting trains and operational artifacts. RCWR has some wonderful sponsors, so please allow me to quickly highlight our sponsor for today's event. For nearly 30 years, Artwork Fine Art Services has served as the trusted logistics partner of some of America's most highly regarded museums, galleries, collectors, and artists. They specialize in expert handling and work passionately and painstakingly to customize unique and creative solutions for door-to-door domestic and international shipping, warehousing, and preservation of your artwork. With offices in Portland and Seattle, be sure to speak with them for your upcoming shipping, packing, storage, and installation needs. If you're not a member of RCWR, please consider joining us today. We are the represented collections professionals group in the 9 Western states, so Washington, California, Oregon, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, Alaska, Hawaii, and Idaho. But if you don't live in one of those states, but you're still benefiting from these webinars and you want to join us, we welcome you in our community too. In addition to this webinar series, we also have an amazing quarterly newsletter, host some regional events, and plan an amazing community service initiative in conjunction with the Western Museums Association annual conference. Membership is only $15 a year to be part of this great community, so please consider joining today at rcwr.org. A few logistics: we are recording today's webinar, and we will be sharing it on the Registrars Committee Western Region YouTube page within a few days. So if you don't want your likeness captured, the possibility of it on the side screen there, just turn your camera off. Also, this is a meeting, so you have that ability to be on camera and to control the sound of your microphone. We ask that you do keep your microphone muted during the presentation part, but then once we do get to the question and answer, you're welcome to join in either out loud or through the chat. Today, we are very lucky to have Melanie Tran here with us as our speaker presenting about all things trains. Melanie is the chief curator at the California State Railroad Museum, where she's worked for the past 6 years. There, she coordinates collections care projects and manages their preservation maintenance program, along with the million other hats that all of us in the collections community wear. She has her bachelor's in art history from New York University and her MLIS focusing on archives and special collections from UCLA. Since there are not many people who have well over a dozen locomotives alone to manage in their collection, there is no one better to speak about managing collections of trains. And so I'm going to turn it over to Melanie to talk about collecting, preserving, interpreting, lending, riding our train collections.
Okay, I'm unmuted. Hi, everybody. Thanks, Beth. Thanks for that wonderful introduction. I am going to just share my screen and then we'll get started here. All right. Well, this has been a really great webinar series to start off with, and I'm really glad to be a part of this effort to share more about what we do in collections and the different unique collections that might be out there. So today I'm coming from the California State Railroad Museum, and we're based in Sacramento, California, which is the western terminus of the Transcontinental Railroad. And we're going to talk a little bit about collecting railroad stories and connecting our philosophy as a museum to the process that we all know well as collections managers and registrars who are working in our different collections here. As Beth said, I'm the chief curator of the museum, and I am learning every day. Railroads are not my background, as you have heard. So this is learning about technology and the history of people, as well as the artifacts that we have in the collection. The California State Railroad Museum is the only purpose-built museum within the California State Parks, and our scope of collection encompasses railroading in California and the West. So though railroads span across the US, we mainly focus on Western California. So that's what our collection comprises. So today I just want to take you through a portion of the museum's collection and talk about how we manage it. We'll go through the same registration duties that you might all be performing and see it through the lens of caring for a historic railroad equipment collection, all while working towards the museum's philosophy and guiding principle. So if you have any questions, please feel free to put it in the chat, or we'll probably also have some time at the end. Our lives are made of railroad stories, and we tell the story of the railroads through the stories of people. So I'm going to ask the question of, have you noticed, as you're going about your life, do you notice trains? Do you notice, do you hear train horns? As you may, perhaps you even ride a train to work if you're lucky enough. Our lives are really enmeshed in railroad language as well as music, terms like being on track or getting off the rails. And now that I have said these terms, you're going to find that you say them too, and probably pretty often. And there's so many more examples, but I won't go through them here. Railroads have become such a big part of our everyday lives that we don't really notice them. Notice how we talk about them and use these terms. We see them, they're kind of just in the background, but what we're trying to do here is take the time to think about how did this happen and why is it important to us today, and try to create these relatable stories and connecting railroad history and culture to what we do today and how that's important. So the collection really informs these goals that we have. Because without the railroads, goods and people wouldn't have a way of traveling through really great distances across the country. So as I go through this presentation, I invite you to think about how your life might have a railroad story or be a railroad story. And maybe we can talk a little bit about that at the end as well. As a museum, we operate under 3 guiding principles: to be a museum without walls, to be of community, and to be a laboratory of learning. Through different partnerships that we've had through Sacramento, we have created an internship program and recently evolved that into a fellowship program where we have collections professionals come through. We will be having collections professionals come through and creating this professional development experience working with our collections here. We work with our community members to put on exhibits and maintain equipment. And sometimes we even lend our shop space for others in the railroad business to use our industrial machines. Some of these machines are hard to find, and we work on such a large scale that these spaces become more like community spaces where we share our resources. In addition to all that, we also facilitate loans throughout the state and beyond. So pictured here are some of our community, including staff, volunteers, students, board members, and just general advocates for the museum. So a little bit about what we have in the collection, a few numbers for you to look at. It's a large collection, vast and broad. We have lots of different types of materials, over 50,000 artifacts. And what I'm going to really focus on today is the 123 full-size equipment that we house inside the museum, as well as in a historic shop behind us. But I'll go over just a little bit of the other things that we collect. These are all the little ones, small things that we can put in a box, on a shelf, on a hanger, that don't require a truck to transport when we want to bring them somewhere. And since we're talking about collection stories, these objects can't speak for themselves. So it's our job to pull out these details and find how we can make a tangible connection to our collective past through the stories of people. And through here, you'll see different kinds of objects, as I've mentioned. We have a coat, a deerstalker coat here that was worn by a pretty prominent railroad photographer and historian, Lucius Beebe, and I'll talk a little bit more about him later. We have a Zephyrette uniform, which was worn by Helen Webb, who served as a Zephyrette in the 60s. And what they did was they were pretty much akin to airline stewards, and really filled in the role of host and nurse as well on the train. And this train traveled from Chicago to San Francisco. So it was a several night affair, and Zephyrettes really became the face of the railroad inside of the trains. And these were mainly filled, they were only filled by women at the time. We have retirement plaques, and so you see up in the corner, F.K. Hernandez. Each star there represents 10 years of service. And so that's, and this person served with Southern Pacific for that long. So people tended to really spend most of their careers working for the railroad if they did. And it was a really committed career. And then down in the bottom, we have a Central Pacific Railroad Hospital window from the building in the 1860s. That was a hospital built specifically for Central Pacific employees who were, the railroad is a dangerous business. It's a dangerous place to be sometimes. So always look across and make sure anytime you see a track, just assume there's a train. So these are some of the small things that we have in the collection, and I'm going to focus more on the larger items. These are just a few examples of what we have in the collection. They're a little gritty and a little dusty, but so we are really fairly young institution. We're only 40 years old, but the collection has so much depth and breadth because of the community that has committed to preserving railroad history in the country. The core of this collection, and I'm talking about everything big and small, was formed by a donation from the Pacific Coast chapter of the Railway and Locomotive Historical Society. And this group began collecting in the 1930s as they saw the need to preserve these technological wonders, really, towards the end of the steam era as the railroad industry transitioned over to diesel and electric. And so this was happening in the 30s and 40s. And so that was really the prime time to start collecting these examples. And we kind of have an encyclopedic example collection of different types of locomotives, different types of cars, cabooses, all the different functions that a railroad needed to fix locomotives on the track, what we call maintenance of way, and just different types of technology that we have. And again, we have over 100 pieces that we care for. Many of these locomotives and rolling stock, which is basically anything that's not a locomotive that's on wheels, on track, are sole surviving examples in North America. So they're pretty unique pieces in some cases. The museum owns 5 of the fewer than 35 full-size steam locomotives in the US that were built prior to 1880. So because of this collection, because of all the community that we have this collection, so we really rely on the community of railroad historians, enthusiasts, and rail fans to help inform our work with this full-size equipment. As you find out with the rest of this presentation, the collection comes with unique challenges and opportunities. So we'll go through these collections management tasks and try to create a tangible connection to history with using the things that we know how to do, viewed through the lens of collecting stories. In addition to objects, these tasks really have taken on a new meaning for me. But we can't do this work alone. This work is complemented by our staff of educators and interpreters who facilitate a space of discovery and learning. I mean, after all, without the opportunities that exhibits and interactives afford, collections wouldn't be able to live in the world. And that's really what we're trying to do, is create space and create a dialogue surrounding these objects so that we can bring them to life. So I'm going to go through each of these categories while highlighting some of the projects that we've worked on, and also touch on some of the stories behind the object if I have a little more time. So we'll start off with photography. So how do you take an object ID photograph of something that is over 60 feet long? And it's on permanent display. We have all this infrastructure around it to get people in and out of it. So we have staircases. And really, this object has not moved in, it doesn't get taken out of the museum. It's a permanent exhibit. So how do you get that photo? And so this is one of the things we're experimenting with, is taking things out and doing 360 photography. So this is a really large example of what we do. I know some of us do 360, 3D photos, scanning, and this is kind of that attempt, that approach applied to the equipment here. So you see that the car is spinning on our turntable, which is what was used to switch tracks and get things. And you'll see behind the car, there are different doors where each door will lead to a different track of the roundhouse. So kind of just a little function of how our exhibits work here. So just a little bit about the car. The dining car was built in 1936. And it probably throughout its 31 years of service served over 1 million meals to its hungry passengers. On its maiden run in 1937, the Cochiti, which is the name of this car that ran on the Santa Fe Railroad, the menu included sirloin steak for two, for guess how much? $2.75. A swordfish steak saute for 75 cents, and an old-fashioned boneless chicken pie for 85 cents. I know we're a little ahead of lunch, so just whet your appetite there. So the next category is storage and movement. How do we have large objects, so a lot of planning has to go into place when we are thinking about moving a piece. And this is a smaller example where we were in the middle of remodeling our lobby. And this piece, which came from the 1915 Panama Pacific Exposition in San Francisco, this locomotive and its sisters was used to transport visitors around the exposition. And it's been in the museum for many years. It's beloved, and it has come to be the face of the lobby as well. They were, a familiar face for people when they came in. But it had to be removed from the lobby because it wasn't serving us in the way that we were thinking about how the lobby could be a more open environment. So again, these are, the process of moving something like this took several months of planning, where you see the yellow dolly underneath the locomotive was custom fabricated in our shops. All the welding and painting was done here and fitted for this locomotive to move, because it is over a couple tons to move this. And you can see in one of the photos here, we had to pull it out. It does roll on its wheels, but it does not operate on its own. So it took a lot of skilled people to push it out and get it onto the dolly. So you had it safely strapped down and then lifted by the big forklift that came through and put on the truck, because it was traveling about 10 miles away to our offsite storage. So a little bit more about the artifact here. It was built by a man named Louis McDermott, who built 3 of these locomotives for the fair. And this one in particular is the only example left that has all its original parts, because it never ran. And oops, let's go back for a second. Yeah, so if you're interested in more about the history of this locomotive and its sister engines, there's a really great YouTube video put up by the Swanton Pacific, and you can look up Overfair Railway, and it has this original footage of when these locomotives ran. So Next is more about storage. And so a lot of our equipment is placed outside because it's part of our operating excursion where we take people can get on the excursion train and take a 50-minute ride down the river here. And so these are some of the examples of things that can happen out there. We get broken windows all the time, graffiti, which, you know, this is something we commonly see on the railroad as we see freight cars go through our towns, right? But these are historic pieces of equipment. And you'll see the graffiti here on the right. There's an example of a before and after, how we had to repaint that. Integrated PEST management. And I have put integrated in as an aside because of the kind of storage that we have for our large equipment, which is sitting in a shop. And it's an industrial shop. It's a historic shop that actually was built in the 1800s, and was the original location of where locomotives were originally built for the Transcontinental and Central Pacific Railroad. So we're using the space as a storage facility as well as an operating shop to repair and maintain all the equipment that we have. So here you see an example of a private car. It's a wood-sided private car that we have in the collection. It was owned by George Westinghouse, who was the inventor of the railway air brake. He used this car as a private car to travel all throughout the United States. And you'll see we have some carpenter bee damage here. Up along the top where there is this unpainted wood. So this is the kind of the wood shavings. What carpenter bees do is they like to make homes in unpainted surfaces, wood specifically. And like their name says, carpenter bees, they basically dig out and eat away to make the hole for their home. And it goes pretty deep in there. And they usually return every season to the same hole. So once we discovered this, we had to patch it up. So a note about conservation. This is the interior of one of our the sleeper car that we have on exhibit, and this too is a permanent exhibit that has been out since the museum opened in 1981. And you'll see the curtains here that are hanging, they're fraying, they have this rubbing against them from people going through. This is an open car where our community can walk through and experience what it would have been like to be on a sleeper car like this. The car also rocks and there's flashing lights. So it's really a immersive experience going into this car. And so we've had these curtains hanging. These are berth curtains, which would have protected sleepers, at night. They would have been, the porters would have installed them so that you have a little privacy inside of your little bedroom for the night. And so these are original curtains that came with the car, and they were probably in service from the 50s. And they are showing their wear. As you can see, there's fraying and all the damage there. So we had to remove the curtains and ask a conservator to come out and do a survey and eventually do repairs on it. So this is part of our process of figuring out how to make sure that these artifacts can live in the world, but also balance that line of preservation and access. So what we're trying to do now is recreate these curtains with a fabric that's pretty close to the original. And we'll be replacing them at some point, and so we'll still be able to get this feeling of what it would have been like if you were on the train at night and all these curtains were up for sleeping. Yep. And a neat fact about this car is that it is has ice activated air conditioning. And so it is a Canadian car which traveled between Montreal on the Atlantic coast. And because it wasn't modernized with air conditioning, electrical air conditioning, it stayed in the north just to keep the passengers in comfort with ice. So we are a community railroad historians and people who care about railroad history and culture. You'll notice that in this video there are a lot of people lined up on the outskirts of this turntable taking photos, and that is because this is the first time in 40 years that this locomotive has seen the sunshine. It was put into the museum when we opened and had stayed there ever since until last year, when we were able to negotiate a loan with the Nevada State Railroad Museum to take these to take a couple locomotives of ours, and then we would, in return, we would be able to host a couple of pieces of theirs. So it was a trade and a loan, and it took about 20 years for this loan to actually come to fruition. So the significance of this is that we were able to move a piece that has been sitting here for the last 40 years, and in return, gain the commissioner's car, which is on exhibit in a museum now, and that's the wooden car that you see up in the left corner there. It's a little worse for wear because the significance of it is it's basically the only surviving car that was at the transcontinental meeting of the rails when the Transcontinental Railroad was built in 1869. So this car is significant because it carried a lot of dignitaries from Sacramento over to Promontory Point, where the two sides of the railway met. And it wouldn't have been possible if we couldn't make this this trade and this loan with another sister institution that we have here. So in thinking about loans, we had to be very careful about, first of all, the transport of these objects, which were put on a truck and driven down the freeway across the mountains over to Reno, over to Carson City, where Nevada State Railroad Museum is. So there was a lot of care in getting the locomotive out, getting it trucked, and then getting it situated in where it is now. And so there's a lot of logistics that get around thinking about how to make this kind of transportation happen. I know a lot of other museums do this all the time, but for us, this was, in my short career here, this was one of the largest transportation projects that we had put on so far. So this car, I talked a little bit about Lucius Beebe, who was a photographer and a historian, as well as an author. Him and Charles Clegg were railroad photographers who traveled throughout the US in this private railway car. And it's a woodside car. We have it on exhibit. It's in the middle of the museum. And you can see the inside of this car on our website. We've done a 360 view of all the rooms there, so it's an online exhibit if you're curious. The car was also instrumental to the founding of the museum, where the couple of the founding members had dinner with Governor Ronald Reagan and Nancy Reagan to allocate funding to build a museum. So it has a really significant history for us as well internally in our institutional history. And it's been on exhibit since the museum opened 40 years ago. So years of people peering into the windows to see what Beebe and Clegg's lavish lifestyle would have been, how they traveled on the rails. All those years of touching and curiosity have left the windowsills marked up, scraped, and we were starting to see the raw wood underneath. So something had to be done. And so we put on this restoration project, and the difficulty about that was that we were cleaning, sanding, painting. All of this was happening in the middle of the museum, sometimes during the day when we had visitors in. And so that was really the challenge, is we couldn't move this object to do this work. Normally, we would be doing this kind of work in the shops. But for this piece, we couldn't move it. And since we decided that it was such a small, it did impact operations and how how visitors interacted with the car, because they couldn't access it for over a month. But the repairs were pretty minor in terms of the whole scope of restoration, that we decided to just do it in-house. So here are some examples of the kind of work that we did to repaint the surfaces and get them to make sure that the car could continue to be on exhibit and not create further damage to it. So it's still on exhibit, and it will be on exhibit for many years to come. I don't foresee us ever removing this piece. So this may have to happen again at some point. Another important piece of what we do inside of the museum is preservation maintenance, and this happens on a daily basis. So we have a crew of 2 who go through all the exhibits and on a routine schedule clean inside and out. And they're also at the same time monitoring for any condition changes, thinking about pest management and environmental issues that are going on. This is a railroad museum after all, so we are not a closed, sealed building most of the time. We have events and we have the roundhouse doors with things coming in and out, diesel fumes sometimes. So these are the challenges that we deal with as a team. And here are some examples of how we handle those kinds of issues. So we have corrosion on the rods that you see in the bottom right picture there. This is on a locomotive that is on exhibit, and that's kind of right at the level of hands. So over time, you see that rod on the front has received a lot of love and has become, covered with this corrosion. And the one in the back you see is a little more pristine. You have that raw steel. So this is something that we think about. And for this case, typically what we have been doing is just leaving it alone. And my argument right now is that that corrosion is actually kind of creating a protective barrier. If we were to remove that, it would just keep continuing the process. So if you know anything else, I'd be open to hearing your opinion as well. But we know we do polishing, we do clean, we do dust, and sometimes we take the locomotives out and actually wash them. So some of the things that we handle here, and the work that we do in curatorial and in preservation maintenance has created opportunities where we're bringing in interns to help us learn. They're learning about how we care for the collection on a daily basis and giving them an opportunity to have some hands-on care experience with the collection. And this is kind of a note throughout all the different activities that I've talked about already. We have staff, and then we also have intern and volunteer opportunities to help us with this work. And then, so you're asking, what about all the big stuff, and how does that operate? Who fixes it, and how do we get everything running? We have a really small but mighty team of craftspeople who maintain the operational equipment. Day in and day out, they're working as mechanics, painters, welders, fabricators, machinists, and just overall problem solvers. When it comes to these machines, things can go wrong, and when you least expect, especially when you least expect them. So this team is always at the ready. There are so many projects that they handle, and sometimes parts on these historic pieces are no longer available or difficult to source, so parts need to be fabricated from raw materials, which is really an amazing part of what we do to ensure that these historic objects keep living in the world. And there's a lot of work that goes into this. So, and though this is a team of skilled professionals with lots of years of experience, it's still a laboratory of learning for all of us, where each problem with, we might have seen this problem before, but on a different piece or in a different way. And so the way that we solve that problem needs to be changed up sometimes. So, they get into awkward situations. You see here on the right, we have somebody inside of the boiler of a locomotive. So you're crawling into this little hole and changing brakes. So all the things that need to happen so that we can operate our historic equipment. So this last slide is a little bit about why we do what we do. So the collection is used as an operation, and we do take passengers on them. They take a 50-minute ride down the river, and a lot of these pieces date back to the 1920s. So some don't have air conditioning. You get the full experience of what it would have been like back then. We have steam locomotives and diesel locomotives that run these trains, and different themed rides throughout the year. But the biggest seller is Polar Express, where riders are transported to the North Pole to meet Santa, and then they come back. I took this video last winter as the train was coming back from the North Pole with its passengers singing carols and drinking hot chocolate. And the sounds and the sight of this locomotive returning home was a reminder for me of why the museum exists and why we work so hard as stewards to maintain this collection. It can inspire, and it really brings history to life, but only if we're actively working towards creating space in the world for the collection to live, and also maintaining these stories' relevance. So with that, I'm going to play this video as just so you can also enjoy a little piece of why we do what we do. So I'm going to stop talking for a second and play the video. I hope you enjoyed that. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to me talk more about railroads and what we do in trains. And I look forward to your questions. I'll stop sharing now then, Beth.
I mean, your video is really cute. If you want to leave that up during questions, you can. It's entertaining. So if anyone has any questions, please put them into the chat. Or you can raise your hand and we can address them verbally as well. But I definitely have some questions to get started. And so I'll start with just from the very beginning. You mentioned you have that 123 full-size equipment pieces. And obviously some of that is locomotives and dining cars and all these items we discussed. But how do you classify full-size equipment?
Yeah, so basically anything that would have run on the railroad as full size. And I make that distinction because we also have little toy trains, models, and different scaled objects. And I use full size just because it's an easier term to understand for a lot of people, where this is the equipment that runs on the railroad. This is the equipment that is used to transport your freight and all the goods that we have and need.
What is the biggest item in your collection?
The biggest item is actually probably the cab Ford, which I had a picture of it wrapped up. It's in the museum. It was in one of the slides previously, and I was trying to find the length of it, but I don't remember how long it is. That is the largest one.
When you're doing that 360 photography for your artifact pictures, are you creating digital models of them? And if so, are you sharing those as well as some of the inside 360s?
Yeah, digital models would be really great. So this is kind of in an experimental phase here where we're creating content and figuring out how to make these large objects relatable and accessible to a lot of people. We don't currently have anything online or in exhibits in the museum that feature this kind of photography, but we're hoping that it can be incorporated into more of our online facing database work there. So it's still in the beginning phases of that. But part of the other reason why we're doing this is because these objects is just so large that it's hard to, even for me, to understand the scale of that and see the whole picture when you're just standing on the ground. Yeah.
I have to admit, I thought I had large artifacts until I learned more about your job. So we have a question about if you have thresholds for what would count as an infestation with regards to IPM. So he's saying they have certain thresholds at their institution, but with your facility not being sealed, are your thresholds higher? It's different?
That's a really great question. And as an infestation, I guess the simple answer is yes, the threshold is higher. There are a lot of things that I have to let go of as a steward of the collection, because we have in our storage facility for the equipment, there are holes in the roof. There are sometimes, we're missing windows. So it's very porous. And so we have birds flying through, bats. So yes, I guess the answer to your question is the threshold is higher, but in my experience with the collection here, we haven't had a typical infestation where the space is overtaken by a specific pest, like a termite or something. So I can't speak to a specific example for that.
We will all knock on wood with regard to that termite comment.
Yes.
How large is your storage facility?
I should know the square footage. Think about a typical locomotive that you might see on the track now and multiply that. So line those up, and I think we have about 27 bays where you can line about 27 and then 2 deep.
Oh my.
Times 2,
amazing.
actually.
Do you offer tours?
That space is currently closed because we are there are some hazards out there. I mean, it is an industrial site, and we are using it for repairs. So it's not available for tours right now.
We have a hand raised from Christopher. Christopher, do you want to unmute and ask a question?
Thank you, Beth. And it's good to see you again, Melanie. Like you, I deal with many of the same things, from rolling stock to active excursion trains. However, being a newer institution, only being founded in 2001, one of the things we struggle with is acquisition of new pieces. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to how you guys go about it, because you're far more successful than we are.
Yeah, so acquisition, we haven't acquired anything large in the last 6 years, but we do go through a process of thinking about how it fits inside of the scope. And really the large question is, can we care for this long term? And we are running out of space. We have run out of space, basically. And since you need track to house something, it's a heavy decision to make. We go through a process. We have an acquisitions team that thinks about the space, how we can exhibit and create space to live for this object to live in the world. And if it does tell a person's story, does it contribute to our mission of talking about the railroad through people? And really, those are kind of the 3 large requirements that we have for considering bringing anything in. And that's not to say that we're not thinking about technology or the span of technology through time as we try to bring our collection back into present time, because I think the last piece that we have is dates from the 60s or 70s. So, railroad technology has advanced quite a bit since then. And this is a question that we also have, is looking 50 years from now, 100 years from now, what should we be collecting? And that's not something that we've really answered yet either. Hope that answers your question. And we can talk more about this one-on-one too.
Mikael, I see you have your hand raised. Was that from before your message went into the chat? If not, you're welcome to unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, so that was actually a new one based on the acquisitions question. I was actually curious about kind of going off of that acquisitions question, if you've ever deaccessioned any part of this collection, and considering the sheer scope of it and the physical bulk of it, what does that process look like?
So we are a state institution. That means we follow state policies for deaccessioning objects, and these follow the same process as if you were going to deaccession a pair of shoes. We need to figure out how to dispose, or and that the word dispose is a really bad word for you to use for this right now, but we don't dispose of any of our equipment. So you have to figure out where the piece is going to go, which it has to go to a nonprofit or a educational facility, usually a public-facing one, and it still has to be described and provenance has to be proven. So we go through all the same steps as you would for any other piece, but the challenge is getting these pieces off-site. So we are actually still dealing with a couple pieces that were deaccessioned years ago, and we're still figuring out how to transport it. A lot of these objects can be trucked, but some can actually travel on the rail with like Amtrak or Union Pacific that would take it. So the challenge is figuring out how to get it off our property. That really is the challenge. And we're dealing with a couple of examples of that now.
Well,
Thanks
thank
for
you.
your question.
Is there any conservation standard between which trains you allow people to board and which ones people only can see the outside?
They're kind of one and the same. What we store outside is what we use on the excursion train. And that really comes down to what's operational right now. A lot of our equipment has not been restored. So these are the examples that have been restored and are in good enough condition to be used that way.
When you're doing restoration projects like the repainting, are you looking to use materials closer to the original or hardier materials that will stand up better to heavy visitation and use?
Yeah, that's a really great question. What we did in that example was the materials that we used, it was automotive paint. And because it would withstand that kind of interaction with our community. But we tried to match the color as best as we could. So we had the paint specialist come in and take a digital scan of the car to try to match that color. But for a lot of our other restoration projects that are outside of the museum, like that happen in the shop, we do try to use the most appropriate materials that we can. I know in the past, so everything inside the museum was restored in the 70s and 80s before the museum opened. And they were very meticulous about doing the research behind what would have been used and trying to match that as best as they could.
For anything that has lost through, integral consumptive use, are you retaining those parts as part of the artifact
Yeah, and the best examples for this come from the original restorations of everything that's inside the museum. They did keep catalog and inventory all the parts that came off as examples of the original parts, because a lot of times it was the original part. And so we have in our storage facility, we have offsite storage, and we're thankful enough that there is a roof and there are doors and it's closed. But through a lot of those aisles, we have pallets and pallets of original parts that were kept for mainly research purposes.
Just a registration nerd question, but how do you number those? Are they the same number, or what's the system for them?
Yeah, I honestly, they are not numbered, honestly. If I have to be honest, they are just in pallets and there's an inventory list of them. But if I were to do that, I would probably just tag it with a tieback tag and number it according to the object that it came from. So it'd probably have the same number with a addendum. Great question.
We've all had things like that where a part comes off, but when something is significant enough to keep, it could become its own object too.
True.
I will note, in case you didn't see it, that Meg Geis Mooney commented that she won't complain about having to move rolled textiles anymore. Your rolling objects are a little bit more challenging to move.
Well, it all is, right? It's all relative once you get used to one thing.
With the loan that you talked about in the commissioner's car and that trade with the Nevada Railroad Museum, how long of a loan / trade is that set up to be? And what would the terms be that you would consider all of the work and the years of planning for a loan of a railroad car?
Yeah, so originally that was meant, that loan was triggered by an event that Nevada State Railroad Museum had in celebration of one of their anniversaries there. And that was a weekend event. So yeah, we wouldn't have done that loan if it was just for the weekend. So we tried to make it a little more worthwhile for everybody. It is set up as a 2-year loan. And so the loan will be expiring next summer in 2024, where we may or may not think about we'll have that discussion of whether this has been beneficial or not, and if we want to extend that a little bit longer to make it, worth our time and resources.
It's a lot of resources to move something like that.
Yes. Yeah.
How many staff do you have that work, staff and volunteers, because we know volunteers are critical in managing collections, but how many people does it take to manage this collection between the maintenance and creating those dollies? I mean, everything you talk about, it's highly specialized and skilled.
Yeah, we are a really small staff. As a museum, we have 13 full-time employees. A lot of seasonal part-time people, volunteers, a huge group of volunteers who are skilled. In the shops itself for this fabrication and moving, they're all the specialists who know about the equipment. We have 2 full-time Sparks employees, and then 3 employees who work for the foundation, our supporting foundation. So it's not a lot.
That's really not a lot for everything you described. I guess a follow-up to that in this question that came in, could we hear more about the fellowship program and the application period for that as well?
Oh, yes. So this is a brand new program for us, and this is our first year that we're starting it. We just flew the position a couple months ago. The fellowship we're designing it to be runs from July to March. It's a 9-month program, full-time, and it is a paid position. So you would these fellows will be park employees, and they can put that on their resume. And what they'll be doing is working with archives. We have a library and archives here inside the museum. And so we're hiring 3 fellows basically who will be working with collections as a whole. And they'll be doing hands-on work, looking into accession records, all the things that we do, but also getting an experience of what it's like to work for state parks and a little more professional development as they go through the fellowship. So it is still really fresh. We just finished interviews for the cohort that we're hiring on for this July, but we're hoping that come next year, we'll be posting the positions up again, hopefully we can do it a bit earlier, maybe in January or February to get it out there. So if you're interested, email me and we can talk more about it, but that's what we're trying to do. And it's pretty exciting, actually.
That's really exciting. So good luck with that new program.
Yeah.
If there aren't any other questions, I'll switch back to my screen.
Yep. Let me in my. Yes, thank you.
And I'm keeping Melanie's contact information up here because, of course, she's the most important one. So thank you so much, Melanie, and for presenting and all that highly informative presentation. I had so many questions more. I could have kept going. And thank you all for joining us today and bringing your questions in. I hope that there's useful tidbits of information to bring back to your institution, whether you have trains, consumptive use, operational artifacts, macro artifacts. I mean, we kind of touched on everything, the most intense loan that I can ever imagine. So if you have any more questions about trains and the care of those operational artifacts, Melanie's contact information is down there in the bottom left of your screen. But if you do have more questions about the Registrars Committee Western Region or this webinar series, please don't hesitate to reach out to me at rcwrvicechair@gmail.com. RCWR is also pleased to announce that we've selected our 2023 CSI Registrars project. So for those who are not aware, at this year's Western Museums Association annual conference, we'll be hosting another community service day supporting the Bowers Museum with a project to remove artifacts, mostly Native American basketry, from degrading plastic bags they were stored in. So that will upgrade their collection and ability to preserve it. So please consider joining us for that. Also, as we said in the beginning, we will be recording, we have been recording today's webinar. So we will be posting the link to the recording from our YouTube page back onto our Facebook page. If you learned something new today, enjoyed it, please share that with other collections professionals or train enthusiasts that you know. Aside from that, our next Wait You Collect What will be in August. So stay tuned for more information on that. And I hope everyone enjoyed the webinar and learned something new today. Thank you again, Melanie. And with that, I will end today's presentation.